This is a summary of the deliberations from the Harvard Radcliffe Seminar Series that was held in March and April of this year. This was in consultation with nearly 40 technologists, scientists, lawyers, and humanitarian responders from around the world. The series explored current barriers to safe, responsible, fair, and equitable use of human mobility data for public good. Before we begin, I would like just to make some comments on the housekeeping. Please, during the presentations, write any questions in the chat, and we will address them at the end. Remember, these meetings will be recorded and uploaded to CrisisReady YouTube channel. And we have our speaker. Dr. Sachit Balsari is an assistant professor in emergency medicine at the Harvard Medical School and Beth Israel Yaakoni Center, and at the Department of Global Health and Population at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He is faculty at the Harvard FXB Center of Health and Human Rights, where his research has contributed to advocacy on behalf of vulnerable populations affected by disasters and humanitarian crises. As respondents of the paper, we have Laura McGorman. She is Global Policy Lead for Facebook Data for Good portfolio, which focuses on sharing privacy-preserving data sets with nonprofits and researchers to address crisis. Prior to joining Facebook, Laura held positions during Obama administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce, OPower, the World Bank, and USAID. She has a BA from Columbia University and a Master's in Development Economics. And also we're having Andrew Schroeder as a discussant. He is the Vice President of Research and Analysis for Direct Relief. He leads the work in GIS mapping, epidemiological analysis, and humanitarian informatics. Without further ado, I'll give the microphone to Sachit. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Andy. Andrew, am I audible?
You are. Good to go.
Wonderful. Morning, everyone. Afternoon, evening, since I see colleagues joining here from Asia as well. Thank you for finding the time to join us this morning. This next hour is really a presentation of a discussion that we had in March and April of this year. We'd invited about 40 participants from 4 sectors, from the industry, from academia, from policy, lawmakers, as well as practitioners, to examine at the end of 2020 how we had applied human mobility data in public health emergencies. These data, several of us at the seminar have been very familiar with for several years, but there was an acceleration of the use of these data in 2020 in a way in which we probably had not foreseen in the years prior to it. There were still many methodological and regulatory issues that were unresolved going into the pandemic that were either addressed or worked around during that year. Our goal of convening that meeting was to try and map where there was congruence between what these different sectors were thinking, where there were gaps in the understanding from these various vantage points of what needed to be done, and what sort of a set of priorities should be for exactly something like the Disaster Mobility Data Network. Were there issues that required a global conversation to make the safe, responsible, fair, and equitable use of human mobility data possible? At the end of this talk, we'll also drop a link to the Radcliffe seminar where you can see who the participants were, whose deliberations led to the content I will present here. In terms of process, what we will do at the end of the month is share a draft of this, an editable draft of this white paper with all of you that have attended this meeting, as well as with all the Radcliffe participants. The Radcliffe participants and others get about a month to respond to it, to add to it, to critique it, to ask questions that the core team can respond to. This is really a joint document that will be produced by all the Radcliffe participants, many of whom have not yet seen this draft. So there's about a 4-week period for that. After which the document will then be available for public comment, and we'll open it up internationally for folks to respond to for several weeks, and then aiming to have a final review document out by the end of the year. The use of human mobility data, as several of you in the room today, just sort of recognizing the names, is something that many of you have not only been familiar with, but actually driven the application of in the last decade, ever since sort of smartphones arrived on the scene. Way back in 2015, colleagues here at the Harvard School of Public Health had shown that effective epidemiological modeling could be done with these data, with tons of caveats, of course, about the use of these data and their representativeness. But there was a concerted effort amongst infectious disease epidemiologists to figure out how to use these data effectively in near real time for modeling. As you can imagine, in the early days, because these were novel data streams, there were, of course, issues around understanding how these data were generated, what the limitations of the data were. Once you figure that out, even the methodological applications of layering these human mobility data onto existing models, onto the temporal and spatial resolution that the epidemiologists were used to, was time-consuming. And sort of the next piece, and where folks were just pre-pandemic, is at the cusp of trying to see how close to real time some of these data could be accessed. To frame all of this work in a way in which the conversation between these 4 different groups held over 4 different days through 4 different sessions in March and April, we had suggested the data readiness, methods readiness, and translational readiness model we've used at CrisisReady. I will use that same framework to present sort of the key messages we find coming out in the white paper. In 2020, of course, there was an acceleration both to the access of these kinds of data as well as the application. We also recognize that the large data processors started making many of these data processed, but available publicly, right? So there were products being put out without necessarily an onerous intermediary step that required academics to receive the data, to turn it into analytic products that were then shared with others. I think the Facebook data for good mobility dashboard is one that CrisisReady was most intimately familiar with and engaged in the development of, and hosted it on the COVID-19 Mobility Data Network, as several of you know. We also, universally, globally received Google's mobility reports. It is interesting to note sort of the formats in which these data or the data products were pushed out, and the Google mobility data reports, as several of us remember, were initially PDF files that one had to manually download, right? There wasn't sort of an API call that just allowed you to download the data directly. And what we're going to try and do over the next few minutes is sort of tease out what folks recognize as the drivers of these kinds of decisions. What we did find from these conversations is that people realized that if there were the 3 buckets of sort of key stakeholders, if we could lump everyone into 3 clusters, you had data providers, loosely used for data processors, data brokers, and so on, including the social media platforms, ad tech companies, etc. Research intermediaries to encompass the scientists, academia, folks that applied an analytical lens to the data that was provided. Often, of course, some element of these research intermediaries were integrated into the technology companies as well. And then the response agencies included public health agencies, ministries of health at the city, state, and sometimes at the national level as well. And what folks concluded is that what seemed to have worked in 2020 was that there needed to be pre-existing relationships, especially between the data providers and the research intermediaries. And that's when application was most effective. Of course, there was an acceleration of partnerships as these platforms became widely available. And the SafeGraph Unicast dashboard, in addition to the Facebook Data for Good dashboard, are examples where a large ecosystem of partners that did not exist in 2019 were at the table. But save that, while a large number of people may have actually had access to the data, it did not necessarily mean that there was that they had either the capacity or the opportunity or the existing relationships to translate those data into epidemiological impact on the ground. And where it worked, it seems to have worked with other pre-existing relationships, pre-existing access plan, right? So you have to have negotiated access. You need to sort of know when to turn the spigot on or how to turn it on, even if the data are not constantly flowing. And sort of where that spigot is varies widely from company to company, but the decision to even make data available is fairly upstream. Pre-existing domain expertise is something that we're all familiar with, and this was a huge problem during the pandemic, as everyone that could code attempted an SCIR model, and sort of the downstream impact of that, and of the least among which was the high noise to signal ratio, right? So policy makers were so inundated with everyone proposing some kind of policy intervention based on their homegrown SCIR model, and this impacted decisions around lockdowns and travel bans and so forth. At the final step, folks realized that what determined whether there was translational impact or the ability to even use these data and response agencies depended on perceived utility, and there might be overestimation of what the use of these data is, or an underestimation. It sort of went both ways around the world. But it was sort of the perception of what the state agency thought these data could or could not be used for. And that did not necessarily translate into demonstrated utility. And so using this framework of data readiness, methods readiness, and translational readiness, I'll take the next several minutes to identify key issues under each of these pillars. Most of the data readiness conversation sort of can be parked under this question of access, really, right? When we talk about the readiness of data, where are the data coming from? What is the provenance of the data? To whom are the data going? And then what is it that is actually being accessed, right? What kinds of data? What is the mechanism of transfer? Who and when do you determine how much data are being turned on or turned off? And then sort of why are these data being shared at all? We'll get to the what and why class, actually, and we'll start with the how, because that was significantly different in 2020. This is a screenshot from the Facebook Data for Good page, where that little tagline at the bottom that says some products are publicly available and others require data sharing agreements, I think encapsulates how these data are largely accessed. There are examples, of course, around the world where Excel sheets with identities were being shared with academics by governments, and this widely depends on the nature of the government, the existing regulatory frameworks, or the lack thereof. I think it would be important here just to acknowledge that by and large, we're talking about data coming from two streams: location data, CDR data, right, from cell phone towers that encompass data from all kinds of phones, right, smartphones as well as simple phones, and then GPS traces from apps on your phone. There are, of course, other ways to collect location data, including your IP addresses and a Wi-Fi network, Bluetooth, etc. But by and large, the majority of the data that we are talking about here, or had talked about at the Radcliffe seminars, was the CDR data and the GPS traces. The CDR data are heavily regulated in all countries, and that means that most people do not have access to it, and sort of that notion of pre-existing relationships and negotiations became very important in accessing CDR data. The GPS traces and the data that was then generated from social media platforms and apps and ad tech data were widely available. That led to the creation of these kinds of publicly available platforms, but many of them require data sharing agreements. And sort of that shift from what is automated and what is bespoke really is about sort of this tension between privacy and utility, right? To determine sort of what is the granularity, the temporal and the spatial granularity, our data being pushed out every few hours, every few days, to what geographic unit was determined upstream, mostly, almost always, by the technology companies. And these decisions were largely made to protect privacy, individual privacy, membership privacy, privacy of sensitive attributes. And privacy was also obviously very tightly coupled with the perceived liability of the technology company. The tension, and then this is orthogonal, because the tension, of course, is everyone else that wants the data. The researchers want the raw data because they have tons of questions about the representativeness of the data, the uncertainty, the bias, which I'll come to in a second. And the public agencies receiving the data, the government sometimes receiving the data, may not actually have the capacity to calibrate how much data to ask for. Is it they might overshoot their ask or under ask, right? And so what they asked for, or how much they eventually ended up getting access to, was determined by, again, sort of impact, capacity, safety, and so on. To figure out where on that calibration axis the data were going to lie, at what resolution or granularity the technology companies were going to release the data, whether there was a threshold of how many people there needed to be in a certain geographic unit for them to be counted to protect privacy, and so on. Sometimes the technology companies and sometimes the tech companies, in partnership with the academic companies, would determine what kind of access was best. By and large, you saw two kinds of models, both of which everyone in this group is quite familiar with. Cubic Workbench, as we know, took a little time. It paused as the demand for these data grew, went back to the drawing board and said, look, a platform as a service model is something we feel very comfortable with. So the granularity that scientists want is possible, but the data set at source, you're working in a very controlled environment, you're remotely querying the data, and there are limits to what can be queried and how much, and you can get the analytic product out from the data setting at source. There are other platforms that several of us here have worked with, where once the data use agreements are in place, aggregated anonymized data are made available to the researcher. The question that most researchers have around sort of receiving this data is clarity around representativeness. And I will hold that thought for a little bit and come back to it when we talk about methods readiness. But that was sort of the tension that we identified around the access axes. Raymond and all suggested a framework that sits on top of this dilemma and says, look, this all depends on context. This tension between privacy and utility, there is not a universal solution to it. There isn't sort of a happy sweet spot where you decide that X kinds of data at so-and-so temporal and spatial resolution can be automated or not be automated, and context is key. There are, of course, certain data that you do not touch. And the next test, of course, is that you do no harm, right? So would the use of these data, if one was allowed to use it, result in harm? A case that comes to mind and that was discussed at the Radcliffe Seminars too was the use of Facebook data for good in a major American city, where the Department of Health, in fact, asked if the data would be shared with law enforcement. And they specifically requested that it not be done so, that it not be shared. And that's sort of the do no harm concept, where it's hard to automate that kind of decision making. It still requires a human in the loop, or several humans in the loop, and checks and balances to understand local context. The kinds of governments that technology companies or academics may be comfortable with sharing certain temporal and spatial resolution would really differ greatly from country to country. And finally, what Raymond et al. Urge in their model is to say, you then sort of need to test the 4 C's, because they're, sort of, they feed back into the do no harm bit. Does the recipient have the capacity to handle and analyze the data, the capability, the competence, and the culture. One way to operationalize this, and this was a model proposed by the GovLab at NYU, is to say that what we're looking for is creating a cadre of chief data stewards in these technology companies, someone that sort of understands the tension that we are trying to resolve and the sort of tests or checklists that technology companies and researchers and policymakers should go through before they start applying these data, right? And that would sort of be the role of a new cadre of professionals that are embedded in technology companies. There are other approaches to accessing these data, and there's a lot of attention on the data empowerment and protection architecture proposed in India. DAPA basically says that you can automate a lot of access. It leans towards automation. It leans very strongly towards taking the human out of the loop by saying that you should have an asynchronous consent manager. So at every point, consent should be automated. Folks should be able to consent to the use of these data, but the consent is asynchronous. It is temporarily removed from the actual time that the data are being processed. Essentially, people can opt in to say, my data may be used during emergencies, right? So it's a sort of a consent-heavy model. The other law that is being proposed in India is a non-personal data framework, which is fairly aggressive, and it says that data that are identified as having public value should be de-identified and put in the public domain. That entities in the country will have a right to these data, will have a right to demand these data from companies, and that these data should all sit in the commons. Those that are concerned about or offer a counter argument to some of these frameworks are ones that say that consent, or ones that acknowledge that consent is not enough. In this day and age where the use of data, the reuse of data is almost recursive, it is hard both for folks that have collected the data, folks that are using the data, folks that are reusing the data, and certainly for the folks that consent to the data to imagine what risks or harms may arise from the secondary, tertiary, and downstream use of these data, especially when the big data are combined with bigger data. It's not just identification, but it's also questions of missingness. When there are groups of individuals or entire demographies that are underrepresented in these data, do you compound that error as you layer on more and more data? And so is there harm that is going to be generated from the missing groups as well? Others have proposed that there are good models for this, and the International Charter, Space and Major Disasters was one that came up a couple of times as a good model where you pre-negotiate access with several private companies, and then when disaster strikes, have access to these data. There were, of course, limitations to activating this. It keeps sort of circling back to that question of who decides, and then who decides who decides. The tasks that we identified in the data readiness column were largely that technology companies, in order to continue to provide access, will need to better define impact, right? The Data for Good programs need better case studies to be able to negotiate with their companies, with their parent companies, more access, more granularity, and just more data and evidence that all this is working. There's need to explore the regulatory frameworks and technological safeguards that are necessary. There's complete absence of regulation in many parts of the world. We have GDPR, we have the California Data Protection Act, and then a smattering of a few laws in a few countries. But largely, this is an unregulated space that is self-regulated. And there was significant critique by the ethicists and the policymakers and the data protection experts in the group that technological safeguards will only go so far. This question of calibration, automation versus bespoke is one that needs a lot more science to it, to understand what framework one can use to decide when the data should be automated and when it needs to have humans in the loop. Like, can we have more robust criteria? Because all of this is still being handled quite organically and depends on individuals embedded in these various agencies that make the decision. The second stream is methods readiness, and it's really about the scientists and the research intermediaries asking questions about how the data are generated. Like, one of the biggest questions that underpins all the methods discussions is about representativeness, clarity on where the data came from. With CDR data, what is the representation that the technology company, what percentage of the market share does that particular mobile phone provider have in the country? Is there a predominance of men that are represented? In one of the studies in the Rohingya camps where they were looking at cell phone use, the male to female ratio was 8:1, for example. Other particular vendor policies that make certain demographics sign up for a particular kind of mobile cell phone service, etc. And then, of course, with data that are generated from GPS traces, what apps and what demographies, again, widely differs from country to country. And it is hard, therefore, downstream to try and figure out really what percentage, what proportion of the population these data represent. There are, of course, the vast majority of you on this call have grappled with this in all your analysis, and the call from the scientific community was to almost demand more clarity from the technology companies. Of course, incentive becomes an issue, and the technology companies, in order to protect some of that information that is proprietary, are grappling with. I think there is an acknowledgement from the technology companies universally that there is need for the scientists to have this information, but what would make this information more readily available and under what circumstances is something that we discuss in the translational readiness framework. Needing to establish the baseline, all of these data are compared to a prior or before time, and technical difficulty with that. Again, it feeds into our conversation about being familiar with the data beforehand and sort of not learning this on the fly as the emergency evolves. And this question of spatial and temporal aggregation. Some of the conversations, for example, get into the weeds about temporal aggregation. Is daily release of data okay? Should it be every 4 hours? Should it be every 8 hours? There is, of course, no standardization across the industry because this is all voluntary. It's sort of being done as part of the Data for Good CSR initiatives, and sort of who then has the power to even guide what these aggregations should look like. Again, a time bin for 4 hours might be very useful for a particular kind of response if we're talking about evacuations and needing to see where people are moving after the disasters, and very different from sort of more long-drawn population mobility. We're interested in predicting epidemiological patterns where the hour-to-hour mobility may not be that important. And then, of course, the challenges of sort of requiring these that the data are presented in universal standard time as far as possible, and sort of what those conversions look like. And again, several of us dealt with sort of these issues, spreading, looking at the spreadsheets and seeing how time was reported very differently in different countries. So even the basics there are elements that we are struggling with. But there's been vast progress, right? Vast progress in 2020. And you see on the right-hand side a whole bunch of products that came out of both technology companies as well as from the academy. Population density maps existed, metrics of radius of gyration started coming out, and so on. And I'm just not going to read this slide. What is the column on the left is really the questions that the scientists across the technology companies and academia are grappling with, right? Saying, look, how do we figure out the standardization of temporal and spatial scales? And the fact that there is not going to be one size fits all, right? The rural-urban context matters, and it also matters what kind of disaster we're talking about, and how accurate we needed to be to understand how many people are on the move, and the spatial, the granularity or the resolution required tends to be very high when you are, looking to see if people have stayed back or if people are still moving when they have to be evacuated out of after, say, floods or hurricanes and so forth. What folks are tending to do is to model against identity, membership, and sensitive attribute disclosure. I think there is recognition that might not be enough, because these attempts to sort of quantify harm, to maybe come up with a privacy coefficient that says that a certain kind of data set would be, would confer X degree of harm, and if combined with another data set, how does that privacy coefficient change, is all mostly currently anchored around the notion of harm being synonymous with de-identification, whether individual or group identity. However, a lot of folks also brought up the point that simply that the re-identification was not necessarily the harm, right? That even if data sets identified folks, it is the exploitation that results from that that is the harm. And so the policymakers sort of push us to think about not focusing entirely on the harm that comes from the probabilistic risk that there will be re-identification of some of these data sets, to the extent that we are basically unable to take advantage of the technologies that are being produced, right? So the concern is that if we hark back to simply the Nurembergian principles that are enshrined in HIPAA and such data protection laws that are concerned with the privacy, with the identity of an individual, we do preclude the application of advances in machine learning and AI to these data sets. The counterpoint to that, of course, is, are we even ready for these technologies? And have we seriously thought about the issues of representativeness, algorithmic bias, and so on and so forth that we need to address before these kinds of technologies can be deployed at scale? The methods readiness section sort of ends with these recommendations, and I think we'd like to acknowledge that folks are working on frameworks for communicating bias while publishing data. What is unresolved is how do you sort of actually incentivize technology companies to do that in a way in which it is not perceived as harm to the company's interests, tools of bias correction, interoperability, and so on. The framework for quantifying potential for harm is one that's interesting. Again, the limits there would be sort of the focus on a privacy as the only manifestation of harm. I'll just take a couple of minutes to wrap up. The translational piece really revolves around this slide. What we have realized is that when there are good examples, they need to be actively socialized so that we can increase awareness amongst the recipients. What one found in 2020 is, even where the analysis was reasonably good and the analytics potentially useful, you often did not have the capacity, capability, culture in the recipient organization to know what to do with the data, right? And sometimes it's sort of overshot at the wrong direction. And so there's a supply demand, so there's the supply side group of activities that need to be undertaken to sort of push these data out actively, part of which is a network like DMDN or CMDN, where we got together with the technology companies as well as the end users to socialize end users to the existence of these data. What is most important, what the success will be when there is demonstrated utility that can then drive meaningful products, right? Can the demand actually come from the field? And this is a little bit of Mino's paradox, where unless the end users know what is possible, it would be hard for them to articulate how to do this. And the 3 or 4 things that folks have suggested that should be considered over the next year or two to help with the socialization of these data are, of course, a library of use cases that several of you have begun to contribute to. Bilinguals, and this work comes out of the GovLab again, saying that you need folks that can straddle these spheres comfortably, right? So data scientists that are embedded in the response agencies, or folks that have worked in response that are embedded in academia, that can translate what is possible and what is needed, right? So sort of make that bridge. There were suggestions to start doing the socialization by incorporating data preparedness into disaster drills as well. So we're all sort of used to or exposed to tabletop exercises and simulations pre-disasters. What is often missing from these conversations is the use and application of novel data streams. To wrap up, again, building on some of the proposals from the GovLab, is this idea of data assemblies, right? So I think what we're realizing is so much of this is not only about safe automation, but about still requiring several humans in the loop as we negotiate, the safety of the data that are required at the resolution for them to be epidemiologically impactful. And those conversations are best done in a democratic process by getting a lot of the stakeholders in the same room prior to a disaster to agree on the terms of access, and then to see sort of what the impact of these data are. We see DMDN and these kinds of initiatives, as well as several others that you've all been part of, as efforts to socialize these data so that our work can be better informed by the needs on the ground. Thank you kindly for listening.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Sajid. So now we could go with Laura and then with Andrew's comments.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sajid. How are we handling Q&A at the very end? I'd like to sort of try and make it interactive. So I don't know if I should start to address some of the questions that were raised in the chat, or how would you like me to proceed?
I think that would be fine, Laura, and just given your time limitations as well, it would be wonderful if you can either respond
Sure.
to the paper, and then maybe we can handle the questions after and when you have
At the end. Okay, sounds good. Yeah. So I think there's probably, hopefully, a proportion of people on the call who are familiar with the Data for Good program at Facebook. But if you're not, we have been in existence for about 4 years. We started with a bunch of maps around disaster response in 2017 that Andrew and team, I also see we have some NetHope alumni on the call. So NetHope was also an early sort of adopter of those insights. And we moved towards trying to build mobility data for the purposes of infectious disease outbreaks in 2019. And I think one of the things that our program learned a great deal about is that it's really hard to build the ship while you're trying to steer it. And so although we built a lot of new data products as COVID was emerging, the fact that we had several years of experience in working with mobility data and understanding the types of insights that would be valuable for researchers, I think helped a great deal. And I think for all of us now, having had such scaled use of this information over the last year and a half, we're so much better positioned than we were before to address new research questions, whether or not it's trying to understand the threat of climate change around the world using satellite imagery, which is something we're really interested in trying to do better. Things like modeling social vulnerability around the world where you don't have that data. We all know in the United States, the CDC Social Vulnerability Index is heavily used, but an international data set on those sorts of questions about how vulnerable populations are doesn't exist. So I think what we hope to do is take a lot of the lessons learned from COVID-19 and bring them into the future and figure out how we can be increasingly effective in the data sharing space. So a few lessons learned from my point of view are that, being ready. CrisisReady talks about, readiness on a range of fronts. I think tech companies also have to be ready with a lot of lived experience on how to do data sharing in a way that's actually impactful. And I think one philosophy that our team takes very seriously is focusing very strongly on building these data products and having sort of product manager mindsets when we do that, as opposed to I would say the opposite end of the spectrum focuses on this sort of data dump. So just put a lot of data out there and see what happens. We are pretty strongly in the camp that you have to build purposeful data products that answer specific operational and research questions, not only for that data to ultimately be impactful for the end user, but also as a way to be protective of individual privacy. So the more that you're in the business of just releasing semi-raw data, you're going to be putting yourself in pretty significant harm's way in terms of re-identification risk. This is years ago, but there was a couple pretty famous hackathons and bug bounties out of other tech companies where, I won't mention names, but re-identification occurred within 10 minutes of certain files being made public on the internet. So we have a lot of lived experience, good and bad, that we can learn from. And I think we continue to feel very strongly that we want to release more and more data, but do so in a way that's designed to answer specific questions and is done in a way where you're answering by the development of a model or a metric, as opposed to just dumping a bunch of data on sort of the open source platforms of the world. And interestingly, I do think that kind of stands in contrast to some of the legislative environment. This is something Sachin, Andrew, and the broader community and I have talked a lot about. When you get into the business of talking about mandatory data sharing, and you make laws that are just about sharing data for the purpose of data sharing's sake, it becomes really worrisome to people who want the problems that we're trying to solve being at the center of the conversation. I've done a bit of research. I worked on open data policy in the United States, and there are actually open data policies already in about half of the countries in the world. And so when we think about whether or not those have delivered the kind of outcomes that they're designed to achieve, I think a lot of people would suggest that the ultimate impact of those laws has been mixed. And so how do we as a research community and a humanitarian community sort of be the bright spot in the data sharing space to say, it's not just about sharing data, it's about collaborating on a set of shared problems. It's about creating a community who's uniquely equipped to work together to be able to solve those problems. I think the COVID-19 Mobility Data Network and CrisisReady is a great example of that, where you had the right skills in the academic sphere to be able to support governments around the world. But then you also had governments who were engaging directly. And I think that's another lesson learned, which is while we don't necessarily feel like it's a good idea or even a scalable strategy to be creating MOUs with every government in the world, the more that you can create data sets that are differentially private and fully public, the more anybody can use them without there being re-identification risk. So that could be a government entity that is trying to understand the effectiveness of their lockdown policy, or that could be a startup that's working to build cool new types of drones. And we see people of all varieties and organizations of all types now leveraging our fully public data. And we're increasingly trying to move into that sphere, because if you can make something differentially private and fully anonymized and create no restrictions to use, potentially you have a Creative Commons license that asks people to adhere to certain rules around non-commercial use or things like that. But the more you can have paperwork just simply be not part of the equation of how you do your work, I think immediately we get the kind of impact and sort of open and free collaboration that we're looking for. The downside of that, of course, is as tech companies, we become less and less capable of then understanding from a reporting perspective what our data is being used for. And I think that's the major concern, at least that my team has, is that, it's brilliant the kind of impact you can achieve when data is fully public. The scale goes through the roof, but your visibility goes through the floor. And then when you're asked at the end of the quarter to report on what your data was used for and whether or not we should continue investing in X or Y, you have this tiny, tiny set of we call it following the breadcrumbs of impact. So, you get a survey response here and you follow up with that person. Oh, okay, Indonesia is using mobility data in this way. Or you get someone, reaching out to you over email with a question, and then you follow up and you figure out, oh, they're doing really interesting work in Papua New Guinea, preparing for their census. But it's these tiny, tiny samples of the overall population that's using your data. And so how do you strike that balance between trying to achieve maximum impact while raising the floor of your visibility as a data provider? Because like it or not, we work for businesses. And even though Data for Good has nothing to do with revenue streams for Facebook, we do have to report internally some basic analytics on what our program is achieving. And it's really hard. And the scale, I mean, our publicly available data sets were downloaded 1.3 million times last year. And of that, probably have 75 responses to a survey on how people were using the data. So, do the math on what percentage of sort of usage we have visibility into. It's really, really tiny. So anyway, I welcome creative ideas that this community has on how we strike that balance between sort of maximum scale and impact, and then also just trying to create a world in which data providers can continue to offer this data by having sort of at least the visibility and metrics that they need to have sustainability to their programs. And I will pass to Andrew.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Sachin. I'm aware that we're running at time a little bit, but I just wanted to pick up on a couple threads and raise some questions that we can, I think, come back to as both part of the discussion here and part of maybe the ongoing kind of editing process on the white paper. Just the one from Laura that I wanted to pick up on is how we define impact in these kind of circumstances. I mean, it's one thing to say that we have low numbers about impact, but I think we actually also have a definitional problem as to, like, literally what does it mean that it has impact, and this is at the heart of this sort of translational dynamic, right? Like, we mean this is not new in the sense that most NGOs, for instance, have this problem with other programs too. But how do you want to trace it as far down to the line to actual operational activity, right? I mean, the goal is not to share data. The goal is to, provide housing, or the goal is to reduce disease cases. The goal is to, end malnutrition. And this chain is often quite unclear as to how you get from kind of the production of analytical products derived from large-scale shared data, regardless of the provenance, all the way out to translation into these kinds of actions. And I think that's going to require, a much more kind of collaborative focus around how we define how that kind of process works, and insight into the decision-making institutionally, which often, we just don't necessarily get. And I, from the process of even kind of thinking through the impact report for Facebook this year, was one of these really hard things. Like, how do people actually think about this? It relates to a second problem that I think came up a lot in the Radcliffe discussions, which is, we think about capacity building as kind of foundational to this translational dynamic, right? We need more capacity. I'm fond of quoting Caroline Buckey around this idea of a missing stratum of capacity throughout ministries of health and emergency management throughout the world that's really kind of fluent in a lot of these kind of novel data sources and methodological techniques, et cetera. That's true, but where are we going to build the capacity? Is this capacity in the Ministry of Health in India? Is it capacity that exists in direct relief? Is it capacity in UNHCR or some other kind of network of arrangements? Or is the capacity something itself which has to be redefined, like in terms of these networks, so that the networks of researchers, NGOs, government, in the relationship is where the capacity resides. And I think in some ways, although it's less clear, and I mean, we're working through a lot of these things. We just went through a whole series of engagements in kind of response operations through CrisisReady with City of New Orleans after Hurricane Ida, with California Office of Emergency Services, where I don't think they wanted to ingest the data, honestly. I think they wanted answers. I think they wanted, help in saying, okay, there's comparative advantage here. If you guys know how to do this and you can answer some of these questions, that's okay. But we had to be very mindful of the operational context that they're within to get very specific and not try to just do, I mean, we talk data for its own sake or data sharing, but research for its own sake is also kind of a problem in these circumstances. It's not the time to, worry about peer review. all due respect to my academic colleagues. Then I think the last thing I just wanted to flag is a question that seems maybe way too tactical, but is really important, and that's speed. So in order, if we're talking about emergency response here, we need to really be able to do things at speed, so that we're framing kind of questions appropriately early on, 48, 72 hours post-disaster, and then we're able to sustain a cadence of activity. This is hard to do, actually. Like, it's hard, I think Facebook in particular, but a lot of other companies as well, have gotten better at data release early on, having routine processes. We still, are not fully there in terms of getting like really data analysis and sharing at the same cadence that we have operational activity. And I think that's something we still kind of need to calibrate, and it would be great to understand some of the thinking behind that, especially as we get into some of the questions Sasha was raising, right, around disaggregation, according to gender, other vulnerabilities, questions around, being able to effectively understand, rights and variances in kind of vulnerabilities across geographies. All of these require some domain expertise. It requires some familiarity that slows things down. Maybe that's a good thing to slow things down, because there's a trade-off in terms of the ethics and controls and these kinds of things, but it is an impact on operational activity. And I think just as we have this, privacy utility question, we do have these speed and operations, kind of trade-offs that we really need to think through very practically, in a way that wouldn't be that different from a lot of other programs, but needs to kind of focus here. So I would love to hear other folks' response. And I know we have some questions in the chat, so I will kind of leave it there, and hopefully we can open up to some other folks.
Thank you very much, Andrew and Laura. One thing I wanted to add to it that we didn't have an opportunity to bring up is, of course, the financing for all of this, right? So while peer review may not be important, I think the pandemic was an exception where you found the research community pivot to doing this work for several months in mission mode, but that's sort of not sustainable. And then how do you get the emergency funds you need to do this? And OCHA's anticipatory funding was something that had come up during the Radcliffe deliberations as a model to think about and to say, should there be pre-allocated funding that would invest in this in order to then have greater gain downstream. But a more serious conversation around how do you also socialize donors to support this work while it is still an evolving science.
I noticed that Rachel had a question, and I wondered maybe if you wanted to jump in and ask that.
Yeah, Andrew, thank you very much. And thanks to all the presenters. This has been a really I work in a research space, which is kind of targeting digital research methods at vulnerable populations, which I'm sure are captured in some of the data sets that you're talking about. So, I mean, I'm interested, right? I mean, there's a tension there. We want to know more about those specific populations in order to make sure that services reach them. But then how do you deal with the tension in governments about potentially either quantifying them or revealing them as a population when they might not be, when that could have an adverse impact later, either on policy or for those specific populations? Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Maddie is not on this call, but I would say that he might have urged, if this was a part of our seminar deliberations, to sort of go back to the framework that he offered, saying, our data here that may otherwise fall in the do no harm category, do they become the do not touch data? Because it's finally about context. Or do they move up from, yeah, you have the capacity and the capability to analyze these data, but should they be moved to the do no harm capacity? And the challenge, of course, with all of this in the absence of regulation is who decides and who's keeping an eye on it, right? This is all still quite self-regulated in many parts of the world. And especially among the populations that you're talking about. I think Stefan from the GovLab would say the stakeholders should have been at the table. You know, the data assemblies are one way to sort of think about this and have the vulnerable populations have a say in, you know, how their data may or may not be used. I think sort of those are the lenses that we have currently to work with.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I also think it's really hard though, because when you don't share data, which we don't, Facebook, we don't identify any vulnerable communities as like those raised, but then you have people trying to create workarounds for that and using things like our ad tools to try to identify refugee populations. And, you know, we struggle internally. It's like, well, we don't want to identify refugee populations because all of the risks involved, but then you have people using data that's not fit for purpose and potentially, you know, arriving at conclusions that would be less accurate than something we could create. So I don't think there's a clear answer. I just think that I would agree with Sachit that it's probably in the do not touch, but where we can create safe proxies for vulnerable populations and create some level of insight. So for example, we have a tool called the Social Connectedness Index, which doesn't reveal anything that's specific to a person, but shows the density of friendship ties between certain communities where there's an outpouring of refugees, and potentially, you know, if you're looking at social ties between the US and a place like Afghanistan, or social ties between the US and another country that has an outflow of refugees, is that a way that you can sort of safely proxy potential refugee flows without doing anything that's re-identifiable from sort of an actual mobility perspective? So I think it's trying to be helpful while being very, very cautious at the same time.
Thank you, Laura. I see that Phil has his hand raised in this question in the chat too. But since we are close to the hour, just before folks leave, I wanted to take a second to just acknowledge an extraordinary and very large team that was behind all of this work. Many of them are here. It's great to see Taka and Maham rejoin. Big shout out to Jen Chan, Caroline, Andrew, Nick Jones, and several others from the CrisisReady team that worked through March and April. And also a sincere apology on our behalf. This report is a couple of months later than we would have liked. And then there was just the pandemic hadn't apparently ended. And so we were a little preoccupied with what's going on in some other countries. Over to Phil. Phil, you had a question.
More of a comment and a thank you. I also work at the California State Guard, and during the recent wildfires we had, especially the Caldor fire in South Lake Tahoe, your data maybe couldn't be used for, we're not always in a response mode, but we're supporting especially recovery mode. And just being able to, within a day or two, you sent me an email, I go to the Guard, I show them the data, it brings up questions about, yeah, we can't, it doesn't, we might not use it right now, but if we ever have a big earthquake, we need to be familiar with the data. And to me, from our after action reports in previous years, getting agencies familiar with the data, the resolution, the people, the questions, you were able, your team, to convert the format of the data into one that was much more useful for us in a couple hours. And I immediately pushed it out and combined it with the data set. That's really big. And one other comment simply was that the Laura's questions about getting feedback, continued socialization at public safety conferences, maybe asking questions at the end of a presentation about who used our data, or in, you know, a web environment, a widget that lets people say, yeah, we used it, is an additional way she might get feedback of it. We all recognize the importance of feedback, but I just wanted to give a shout out for, we really appreciate your efforts to reach out to us so that we can move the ball down the road, you know, by getting people familiar with the data and what it might look like, and make them think about other ways in which they could use the data. So thank you.
Phil, thank you. A shout out to Jen, Shenyu, and Akash, who were entirely responsible for multiple doodles in the background to make the final reports look like they did. And you had a question about insurance data. I think there are partners in the network that do so. The challenges there often are just a real-time availability of these data. So those that are working on these data in peacetime, if you will, do layer them when feasible with insurance data. I think that connection between human mobility data and the clinical data is also an area where we will likely see an explosion of academic work in the coming years. You know, there were so many challenges during the pandemic in just terms of interpreting what even testing data meant in the absence of any standardization on how testing data reported, for example, around the world. So I think insurance is, you know, perhaps a couple of steps downstream.
I know that we have to end. I just wanted to really call attention to the link that Andy just put into the channel. The DMDN meets monthly. There's a Slack channel. We're happy to have folks join, and we will be doing obviously many more of these. There's a calendar available on the CrisisReady website of upcoming events. And as Sachin mentioned, there's also the calendar that's associated with the editing and publication of this white paper. And we'll be doing upcoming events in multiple parts of the world to engage a number of stakeholders in different countries around a lot of the issues that we've just described, to build these networks, make sure people are familiar in advance, and that we have a community of practice that really works in real time around applications of this data for all of the issues that Satya just outlined. So thanks to everyone again, and please feel free to engage on Slack and join us in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for everyone who's joining.
Andrew, Laura, thank you for joining.
Yes,
and
thanks.
Yeah, thanks all of the participants. Take care, and please check the links on the CrisisReady website and join the Slack. Also, like, we have events till the end of this year. We're gonna talk about data privacy in December, about disaster risk reduction and mobility. So also, if you have any questions, just shoot me an email. I'll put it also here in the chat, and it's also on the CrisisReady website. Thank you very much for everything. Have a great day.
Thanks, Andy.